Chair Galvin. I believe we might have everyone on at the moment, but Secretary Atha, can you confirm?
Yes, I believe we have everyone that was planning to attend. We will upgrade the new member just prior to the oath.
Very good. Then I will go ahead and call the meeting of the Board of Public Utilities for the City of Santa Rosa to order. If we may have a roll call, please.
Yes, Chairman Galvin.
Here.
Vice Chair Arnone.
Here.
Board Member Badenfort.
Here.
Board Member Grable.
Here.
Board Member Mullen. Board Member Watts.
Here.
Board Member Wright.
Here.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. I wanted to first announce that we're going to pull item number 3 from the agenda. So we will not be doing any presentation at this meeting. And if we may move to item number 2, which is statements of abstention by board members. Do we have any? Seeing nobody, that'll take care of item number 2. Again, item number 3 has been pulled. We'll now move to item number 4, which is the board reorganization, seating of new members, and announcement of chair. Although we are not going to be announcing the chair at this point, there's been no formal announcement from the mayor at this point. So, Secretary Atha?
Yes, and so Mr. Walsh, if you could open your video and your audio, please.
Is this going to work or am I sideways?
No, you're good. So
Right.
if you please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Mark Walsh, do solemnly swear
I, Mark Walsh, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully
and that I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations. Welcome to the Board of Public Utilities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Board Member Walsh. Welcome to our board. We'll go ahead and swear in the other 2 reappointed members, and then we'll come back to you in hopes that you'd like to make some remarks. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Badenfort,
Oops. Yes.
please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Lisa Badenfort, do solemnly swear
I, Lisa Badenfort, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully
and that I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Mr. Wright,
I'm here.
if you could please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Glenn Wright, do solemnly swear
I, Glenn Wright, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully
and that I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
discharge the duties of which I'm about to enter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you. If you would like, Board Member Walsh, we'd be happy to hear from you as far as your background and your desire to serve on this board. And we welcome you.
Certainly, and thank you, Chair Galvin. I've been in public service for approximately 30 years. I started as an accountant one at the Sheriff's Department. I was invited to apply for that job by another county employee that had an indirect financial interest. My mother was a social worker. She picked up the phone as I graduated San Francisco State University with a degree in accounting. And she said, "You better get down here and apply for this job." So, and it worked out. I was at the Sheriff's Department for 7 years, passed the CPA exam, got audit hours at the Auditor Controller's Office, and from there garnered a CPA, worked at the County Budget Office for a couple of seasons, was promoted to Assistant Auditor Controller, was there for 7 years, and left the county as the Information Systems Director after 6 years and joined the County Marin, where they had problems with the financial system implementation that resulted in a lawsuit with RICO charges that were eventually settled. They had inability to produce financials. I was hired there, got 3 years of financials out clean, got them caught up to speed, and got out of there with them in good stead. The reason I bring up Marin County is that Hal Brown asked me a question that I think the answer is important for your body. He said, "How are you going to reconcile two elected officials?" And I was going to be their first appointee, elected treasurer, elected auditor. And you got to reconcile with the treasurer that's still here and he's going to retire. And he was a very high qualified. And I said, "I will accept the decisions that the office made in the past as if I made them myself." And that's what I want to promise to do for you and your body, to be a respectful member and to represent the Board of Utilities only as a whole, and to accept the decisions of the board and help explain them. So I want to come in as if I made the decisions as well and be a member of your board that's cooperative. From there, I want to thank the Board of Utilities, especially the outgoing members. But as far as the members that are still here, Chair Galvin and Vice Chair Arnone, I've been involved in nonprofits, Social Advocates for Youth, Redwood Empire, Red Cross, Goodwill Industries, the Redwood Empire, and I've never been involved in a nonprofit or a fundraising effort when they're broke, where your name and Mr. Arnone's name didn't show up. So I want to thank you. Sometimes I got pushed onto those boards because they wanted a bean counter to figure stuff out. Rod Dole would assign me to things and Tom Shoplin would assign me to things. And luckily then I was just a kid. I didn't know they were gonna ask me for money, but you guys showed up. The other thing I want to do is thank Member Grable, Battenfort, Watts, Wright, and Mullen for their good hard work. I think the members of the Board of Utilities are either one or the other. They're too stupid to duck the job or too brave to not take it. And I'm going to assign bravery to all of you. And my only goal is to be a valid member, to be part of you in a unified voice, and to be helpful. And that's all I got to say.
Thank you very much, Board Member Walsh. Welcome again. We're happy to have you, and we look forward to your active participation. I don't know if either Board Member Badenfort or Board Member Wright, and having been re-sworn in, have anything they'd like to say? Since they're both, oops.
Nope.
Just looking forward to serving. It's an honor. It's an important system, an important staff, and such an important function in our city to serve our users. And it's an honor to be here. And welcome, Board Member Walsh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Wright.
Well, I'll say welcome, Board Member Walsh, and just looking forward to the next 4 years, and that's all I have to say.
Very good. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll now take public comments on item number 4.1. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha, do we have anyone?
We have no public comments.
Great. That will conclude item 4.1. I need to go back. I neglected to give my admonition for each meeting, which is please all board members to mute your phones and microphones when you're not speaking, and please put away cell phones and personal computers. With that, we will move to item 5.1. Director Burke.
Thank you, Chair Galvin and members of the board, and welcome to our new member, and congratulations to our new and reappointed members. Looking forward to working with you. Our first item 5.1, is an asset management overview study session, and making the presentation will be Supervising Engineer Andy Allen and Associate Civil Engineer Jason Roberts.
Good afternoon, Chairman Galvin and members of the board. Thank you for letting us make this presentation. Jason Roberts and I are here today to make the presentation. I do want to acknowledge we have two other engineers on our staff in the asset management team, Casey Claiborne and Tanya Mokvitz, and with Tanya focused on the regional system. Last year, we included information on the entire asset management team, including our IT group. And of course, they're very important to all we do. But today's presentation will be focused on how we use asset management to develop our capital improvement program. Next slide, please. I will cover the first two items, what is an asset, and kind of a list of our water department assets. And Jason Roberts will take care of the next three items, and then we'll both be available for questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. We have two definitions for what is an asset. The first one is kind of the dictionary definition, a useful or valuable thing, person, or quality. But in terms of asset management, a more clear definition is an item, thing, or entity that has potential or actual value to an organization. And we have lots of those. We have and lots of value in our organization. Can we move on to the next slide, please? We'll start with our local water assets. You can read the list of the main bullet point items and assets that we have in our system. Certainly we have smaller ones, water service lines, meters, meter boxes. Of course, each of those booster pump stations has multiple assets associated with it, including even our reservoirs have multiple assets at them. There's some dollar figures down below in the slide that show what our system is worth as of 2019, and we'll need to update that, but probably about 5% more than it was at that point. And we kind of giving you a quick look at our CIP needs over the next 20 years or so. And all that number is based on pretty much aging of our infrastructure. That's not how we decide what gets replaced. And I'll talk about that with our next slide. Next slide, please. So I'll show you the water system both by age and by pipe material. So this is a good picture of the age of our system. Obviously, pipes out either in the fringe or actually in the heart are our newest pipes, because we've done quite a bit of replacement in the heart of our city. And then in between, we have some middle-aged pipes, and then we've got orange pipes, which are pictured as orange in this picture, that are on the older side. And then we have an old one, and affectionately referred to as Old Red. It's a piece of steel pipe that has been in the ground since before the turn of the previous century, and it's still functioning fine, which is great. And that's kind of a testament that we just don't replace based on age, that we evaluate the condition of the pipe and in our system before we go to replace it. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So here we have our water system by material, and you can see that the great majority of the pipe the majority of the pipe in the city is AC pipe. It's been a very good functioning pipe for us, and has worked really well. It's actually, when you look back at the age, some of that is the pipe of age that would or should or could have been replaced already, but it's functioning well. So we are not focused on that at the moment, but we certainly look at the pipe type as a factor in when we go to replace it. So you can see that again, on the fringes of the city where we've had the newest development, and some of the older parts of town where we have had pipe replacement projects, we have a lot of the blue pipe showing. It gives you a good distribution of the pipe materials throughout the city. Next slide, please. Similar to what we said about our local water assets, here's a list of our local sewer assets. Here's the main ones and the number. And certainly we show you how much it would cost if we had to replace it all, again, in 2019 dollars. And then what we would, if based on age of all these pipes, we would need over the next 20 years. And again, we're fortunate that our pipes seem to be lasting a little longer than average for the industry. So we're happy to take that, but we do know that there is a need in the future for replacing of all these pipes. Next slide, please. Similar to what I showed on the sewer system by age and sewer system by material, you can see that the red pipes are our oldest pipe in our network. A lot of that is our sewer trunks, as you can see some definite trend lines going east-west and north-south. Our sewer trunks are getting of an age that replacement is necessary or going to be necessary. So there is certainly some money dedicated over the last few years and in future years for sewer trunk projects. And then we have some older pipes also in the system that also need to be looked at and be considered for replacement as we move forward. We have a few subdivisions, older subdivisions from town that are still with older sewer pipes, but we're trying to program those in as necessary and needed as we move forward. Let's move to the next slide, please. Again, here's our sewer system by material. There's a little less of a percentage of AC pipe, a little more PVC pipe in our system and a few others, which bodes well because our PVC pipe is, number one, newer and has a much longer life than the AC pipe and the others. So we're happy to have as much as we have in our system and looking forward to making replacements of those sewer mains when it becomes time to do so. So you can see, again, it's distributed pretty much throughout the city. Again, the heart of downtown area, the oldest parts of town have been replaced already with PVC, and the fringes and newer development also have PVC. Go on to the next slide, please. So we've talked about the local water and local sewer, and certainly a big component of our assets are our regional water reuse system. The biggest single one there is the Laguna Treatment Plant. Included in the Laguna Treatment, we have our laboratory. We then have our reclamation lines and geysers pipelines and the biosolids. And you can see just this one, we actually totaled up the number of assets that are right there or within our sub-regional system. And if you look at the number there below, that is our needs over the next 20 years for just the LTP, just the treatment plant. And of course, that's where much of the focus will have to be currently. And I'll explain that more in just a second. If we move over to the next slide, please. We do have a regional system overview next, which includes both our geysers pipeline and our reclamation line. The geysers was installed in 2003, so we are a long way from needing any kind of replacement of that pipe. But we do have maintenance issues and things of that nature that focus some of our projects, our capital projects. But again, that's a much newer pipe. Our reclamation system, it was built starting in the 70s, early 70s, and into the 80s and even into the 90s. So it will be a pipe network that we'll be starting to look at shortly. But at the moment, it seems to be functioning well, and we haven't had significant issues with the pipe network that is there. So this is the main body of the regional system. And if we go on to the next slide, you can see the north end, which includes going past Windsor and up to our terminal reservoir at the geysers. So we have all that pipe that we're responsible for, plus our pump stations as we head up the hill. So that's the kind of a summary of our regional system. And we don't want to forget the next slide, because we really feel like our water department's greatest assets are our people. And here's a picture of a few of them. We're living in a different world. We wear masks. We work from home, some of us. But it is the people that make this system function, make our asset management system work, and make our whole department work well. So we don't want to forget about them. And we're happy not to have to replace too many of those people very often. So I'm going to turn the next part of the presentation over to Jason Roberts. And if you can go on to the next slide, Roberta, please.
Thank you, Andy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what asset management is, how we do it here at the city, and how we develop our capital improvement program. So what is asset management? couple of definitions.
Jason, I apologize for the interruption. Can you turn up your volume in any way? Or get closer to your microphone? You're coming across as quiet, I think.
Does that sound better?
That does.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, so I'll start over here. I am going to talk a little bit about asset management, what is asset management, and how we perform it here at the Water Department in the city, and also how we use it to develop our CIP. So what is asset management? There's a couple definitions here. Asset management is the practice of managing infrastructure assets to minimize the total cost of owning and operating those assets while delivering desired service levels. And the second one is kind of a continuation of Andy's definition of an asset, which was something that has potential value to an organization. And so asset management is the coordinated activity of an organization to realize value from those assets. Next slide, please. A comprehensive asset management program, asset management programs can have a lot of different aspects to them, but mainly, in order to perform asset management, we're going to need detailed asset inventories. And here at the city, we currently have a computer maintenance management system that catalogs all of the city's assets. We're currently moving that system over into CityWorks, which many of you know already. It's been a multi-year effort and is hopefully going to be implemented here in the next few years. We need operation and maintenance of those assets. We need to perform condition and risk assessment, develop our capital improvement program, and look at long-range financial planning. And I'll go through a little bit, some of these in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So why do we perform asset management? We really want to develop a programmatic approach to replacing our assets so that our system doesn't give us any surprises and we're able to make the right decision at the right time and really look to spend money wisely and make the most of our customers' fees. Next slide, please. And so when performing asset management, we really look to answer some common questions, kind of everyday questions. Which assets need the most maintenance? When should we replace these assets? Are they troubled assets? And when will we need more CIP budget in the near future or far future? And really, this helps us answer which projects we should undertake and how soon. Next slide, please. You can also use asset management to answer some of the bigger questions. What level of service do we want to provide to our customers? And how can we do that sustainably? Helps us identify which assets are critical to sustain performance, which of those assets in our systems are absolutely necessary to keep providing service. And also to answer what are our long-term costs and are we investing enough in our capital improvement program? Next slide, please. So how do we develop our CIP? A number of different things go into CIP development, including a general plan, direction from the general plan, internal master plans and engineering studies. There's regulatory requirements, levels of service, condition assessment, risk assessment, stakeholder input, and of course input from Board of Public Utilities and City Council. And I'll touch on each of these points in the next slides. Next slide, please. So in looking at the general plan and master plans as they relate to our CIP, we really look and make sure that our system is going to be able to support changes proposed in the general plan with rezoning or specific area studies that are undertaken at the planning level. We want to make sure that our water and sewer system can support growth or changes of industry, whatever the direction the general plan outlines. We also look at level of service scoring for our assets. Level of service, for instance, could be water pressure delivery to residential or commercial customers, or it could be water level in the sewer, and making sure that our assets are meeting those levels of service. These studies can also include condition assessment, risk assessment, and also some targeted CIP project development. Next slide, please. Some of the regulatory requirements that we might look to meet using our asset management program and developing our capital improvement program are building codes, and specifically related to seismic requirements for our reservoirs, for our pump stations, and our facilities. Looking at fire code upgrades to our system, making sure we're providing minimum fire flows to our customers. There are department or division of drinking water requirements that we need to meet, make sure we're providing clean, potable water, and that we're not exceeding any MCLs or that there's any kind of contaminants in our drinking water. And there's also National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits, both for LTP and for stormwater. And so we need to make sure that our capital improvement program is helping us meet these regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So looking at level of service, each asset provides value to the city. And evaluating those assets, we can look at both condition of those assets and what it's providing, what level of service is it providing. So we look at things like, percent downtime per year, perhaps on water mains or pump stations, how many incidents are happening per year, whether those are overflows or shutdowns. We look at hydraulic capacity, regulatory compliance, and costs to maintain. So we have levels of service for all these things, and those are really driven by goals and priorities from the top down, and really have to do with what level of service do we want to provide to our customers, and how can we do that in a sustainable manner. Next slide, please. So a little bit about condition assessment and why it's important for our capital improvement program. I like to use the car analogy, so bear with me for a minute here. You'll notice the blue line starting on the left, and where that meets the green line at the top, that would be your new car. And as you start driving it, the car runs great, but over time the performance declines. And so you take it into the shop for an inspection, where they'll do a condition assessment, and then you'll perform maintenance and repairs as needed, as shown by the red lines there. But every time you repair that car, perform maintenance on it, it's never going to get back to that new condition. It's never going to get back to that original performance. And so you do this cycle over time, and the top performance of that asset, of your car, will decline along the black dotted line. And at a certain point, maintenance and repairs aren't going to be enough for that car to provide the minimum level of service that you desire, and you're going to need to replace it. And so you'll implement a replacement strategy, you'll buy a new car, and this cycle will start all over again. Next slide, please. So risk assessment is a factor of, is made up of two factors, rather. It's made up of the likelihood of failure of the asset and the consequence of failure. The likelihood of failure is based on the asset itself. It's really everything that we know about the asset. We look at the maintenance history, we look at condition assessment and observations, and then we look at actual assets or attributes of the asset, the age and material, and we come up with a likelihood score based on all of these things. The consequence of failure is really everything not directly about the asset. So all of the financial, social, and environmental factors surrounding that asset. Where's the asset installed? Is it installed next to a creek? What does the asset serve? Does this water main provide water to a hospital? If this asset fails, how much of a financial burden is that going to be on the city to replace it? You know, is it under the highway? Is it under a railroad? All these sorts of things that can affect or increase risk to the city, but aren't about the pipe itself. So when you take these two factors and multiply them together, you develop a risk score. On the bottom right, you can see kind of a generic matrix where likelihood and consequence come together to tell the story about risk. So if you look at in the upper right, in those red squares there, where we have major to severe consequence and almost certain or likelihood of failure, those are really going to be, you know, the large diameter trunk sewers, and then as we look at the lower right in the orange area, those are maybe new trunks where the consequence is very high if that asset were to fail, but the likelihood is a little bit low. So these are the types of areas where we'd want to, you know, do more frequent inspection, or maybe risk mitigation or resiliency project, or redundancy project to kind of reduce that risk. If you in the upper middle, in the orange squares, those are more of the smaller pipes that maybe have some holes or some cracks, neighborhood type projects, where they may be likely to fail, but they're not as consequential as the trunks. You know, we want to take care of these projects as soon as we can, because these are the ones that turn into higher risk projects. And I bring these two areas, the red and orange, up because this is really where kind of our CIP is targeted. And, you know, we do need to keep looking at the low and medium risks as well, because over time they'll turn into high and extreme risks. Next slide, please. So also in developing our CIP, we take input from stakeholders and the public. We work directly with local water and sewer operations and water reuse operations, as well as water administration. We'll take public input from customer calls and public meetings as well. Next slide, please. And of course, our capital improvement program will take into account direction from Board of Public Utilities, as well as City Council through budget subcommittee meetings and full board meetings or City Council meetings. Next slide, please. So in summary and development of our CIP, you know, we do a data review, we identify assets that need CIP work, looking at maintenance records, inspection data, and pipe information. We'll perform a risk assessment and prioritize which assets need work now. Once the priority projects are identified, we'll refine the scope and confirm funding. We'll work with local operations, TPW, stormwater, and right-of-way as stakeholders in the project. And we'll receive feedback from them We'll develop the project scope, and then we will queue the project for design with capital projects. Next slide, please. And take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Allen and Mr. Roberts. We'll now open it up for any board member questions or comments. Seeing none at this point. Thank you for the presentation. It's always good for us to be reminded of all the assets we have out there and all the pipe that's in the ground that we have to oversee and make sure that it's functioning. So thanks for that. I'll now open it up for public comments on item 5.1. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha, do we have anyone?
We have no public comments.
Thank you. That will conclude item 5.1. We'll move now to item 5.2. Director Burke.
Thank you, Chair Galvin and members of the board. Item 5.2 is a study session on our 2021 water and wastewater cost of service study, our proposed fiscal year 21-22 through fiscal year 24-25 rate schedule, and our proposed update to the water shortage charges. I would like to just take a minute to recognize our budget subcommittee of the board, chaired by board member Watts, as well as participants, board members Grable and board members Wright. We do ask a lot of the budget subcommittee every year, and in particular this year with rate setting, we asked even more, and we greatly appreciate their thorough feedback and leadership in helping us craft rates that are going to be proposed before you today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our Deputy Director of Administration, Kimberly Zanino. Kimberly will be leading this off, as well as introducing the consultants and others that are going to be presenting at today's study session.
Good afternoon, Chairman Galvin and members of the board. Today, as Director Burke said, we are bringing forward the study session on the proposed rate schedule. But before I turn this over to our consultants, I had a few things that I wanted to say. First, I would like to tell you how much Director Burke and I appreciated the time that you spent with us to give us guidance when we met with each of the BPU members and their respective council member. We listened to your input and we kept all of that input in mind as we went through this process. We made sure that while we were going through this process, we were consciously considering the effects of the pandemic on our customers and our community. And those are reflected in our rate recommendation coming forward to you today. I also wanted to just take a couple moments to talk about, since it is related to rates and revenue from rates, that we are and continue to proactively work to support our customers through the pandemic. We are paying attention to and watching the various relief packages that have been coming out. While they don't yet have well-defined processes or qualifications in them yet, we are actively reaching out to those developing those programs to see what assistance we can provide. As it currently appears that customers will have to participate in receiving some of those funds. And so we want to make sure that we are in a place where we can assist our customers with that. We also continue to follow the moratorium on disconnection for non-payment. We are not turning off water meters. And we are also still waiving delinquent fees for our customers and offering any form of payment plan that customers would like to use in order to try to keep up with bills as the pandemic continues. And then finally, I would also like to thank the Budget Subcommittee for their work. We have spent 6 months working with them on this rate recommendation. We have worked with our consultants for the last 2 years developing the financial model, which is the basis for the work we've done. And so I'd like to thank them as well. We asked them to change direction so many times because of the current situation, looking at different scenarios and different ways look at things and different things that we can do. And they did that without complaint. So I very much appreciate that. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to our consultants, Mark Hildebrand and Bob Reed.
Great, thank you. This is Mark Hildebrand, and I'll be giving the presentation on the first half of today's material, and then Bob Reed, whom many of you know from years of work that he's done with the city, will be giving the second half of the presentation. Next slide, please. So the portion that I'll be covering will be the water and wastewater rate study recommendations, and Bob will be covering your water shortage contingency plan and financial strategies related to that. Next slide. Next slide. So I understand that some of you are new on the board, some of you have been around a bit longer. I did want to cover a couple of things briefly just in terms of the steps that we go through when we do a rate study. And this slide shows the 3 general steps that almost all rate studies, comprehensive rate studies, go through. The first step is the revenue requirements. You could also call this a financial plan. And this is really just looking at all the money going into the enterprise and all the money going out. So the money coming in is predominantly rate revenue, the money that your ratepayers pay every month on their bill. And the money and you also have some miscellaneous revenues coming from interest earnings and miscellaneous services that you provide. The money going out will be your operating budget, including some transfers to the general fund, and your capital spending, which comes in the form of cash finance project as well as debt finance projects. So you have debt service in there. So with the financial plan, once we understand all your revenues and expenses and forecast that for a 10-year period, we make recommendations on the best way to meet your revenue requirements, whether that includes a debt service or a debt strategy or not. And then inevitably we have to keep up with inflation at a minimum and so we talk about how much rate revenue needs to increase in order to meet your revenue requirements. The next step, once we understand how much rate revenue we're going to need over the planning period, the next step is called cost of service. And the cost of service is the cornerstone to what's called Proposition 218, which is the law in California that governs how utilities can charge rates or what they need to do in order to charge rates legally. And really the premise here is that you can't charge more than the cost of providing service. And so when we do the cost of service analysis, we're looking at your customers to see how they behave, how they use their system, and how they drive your costs. So this involves understanding how many customers there are, how large their meters are, the strength of their sewage, how much water they use, et cetera. And so we use those metrics to assign costs to your different customer types. Once we understand how much revenue we're collecting from your different customer groups, then we go to the last step, which is rate design. And the rate design is making decisions about how you want to recover revenue. So if you know you need to collect, say, $1 million from your single family homes, how much of that's going to be on the fixed portion of their bill that doesn't change regardless of their water usage? How much of that's going to be on their, what we call the variable portion of their bill, the portion that changes depending on how much water they use? And how is that going to be structured in terms of, is it going to be tiered rates or uniform rates? So we didn't make any changes to either the cost of service methodology or the rate design principles from the last study, but we did make some updates. So there will be some small changes in that regard, but only because we've updated the metrics that go into the methodology and not because we changed how the decisions and how those things were structured. Next slide. So here's a general picture of both utilities, so water and wastewater, and how the funds are structured. And you can see on the left side, those are the revenues that come in. So it's predominantly the user rate revenue, as I mentioned, but you also have some miscellaneous revenue from different services that are provided by the utilities. And occasionally you do receive grants or debt proceeds from debt issuance. Those monies go into various funds, mostly goes into the operating funds, but some specifically go into what you call your CIP or capital improvement project appropriations. And then the money is spent on either operation and maintenance, debt service, or capital projects. There's a series of reserves there, and we'll be talking a bit about your reserves on some following slides. Next slide. So this presentation isn't designed to go into a great amount of detail about all the financial analysis that we did, but we did want to highlight some of the key points to the project, some of the milestones that were passed over the last couple of years. The first one here is a recent issue of debt that the city did called the 2020 Series A and 2020 Series B. 2020 Series A was what we call new money. It was money that's being used to pay for a $70 million UV project, ultraviolet treatment project at the wastewater treatment plant. And then the 2020 B is a refunding. So you're refunding 2012 bonds. And both of these were really good news for the district, for the city as a whole, and for your ratepayers. First, the rates today, if you read the news, you're well aware that interest rates are an all-time low, and the interest rates that the city was able to get for this new money and for the refunding was really historic and a great win for the city. And you can see that in that third sub-bullet there that because of the refunding of the 2012 revenue bond, you're actually going to be saving your ratepayers over $16 million over the next 14 years. So that was a great win. The next thing that we wanted to mention is that the catastrophic reserve, so the reserve targets that we put in what's called the catastrophic reserves is going to increase significantly based on recommendations that you received from your consulting engineers, GHD. And so they have been spending quite a bit of time looking at your different systems and at their vulnerabilities in the event of natural disasters, various natural disasters, earthquake, et cetera, fires, floods, et cetera, and making recommendations on how much you should have in cash, in the event that you need to be able to replace critical infrastructure. And so we'll show you in the next slide some specifics on the numbers that they're being recommending. I've mentioned already that we did update the cost of service analysis. So we didn't change the methodology, but we did update the numbers that go into there. So the way that people use water has changed a bit over the last 5 years, the number of customers, et cetera. So those that will affect the final rate outcome. And then I mentioned that we are keeping the same rate structures that you've had historically. Next slide. So some specifics about the catastrophic reserves. On the water utility side, your current catastrophic reserve policy was to keep about almost $6 million, $5.75 million, and GHG is recommending that you increase that to $17.5 million. The good news on this is that from a rate increase standpoint, none of the rate increases that we'll be recommending are being driven by this increase in reserves because the cash balances that the district has on the books right now is actually sufficient to be able to fund that increase in the reserve target. So none of the rate increases that you'll be looking at will be driven by this. And so that's good news for the utility that you can immediately fund this new reserve target. On the wastewater side, it's being proposed to increase from 6.8 up to 21.5. And again, your reserves are able to fund that. That's actually largely due to the favorable bond issue that I mentioned on the previous slide. For regional wastewater, formerly known as sub-regional, they're recommending, we're putting in a placeholder. The GHG actually has not finished its recommendation on what that reserve target should be. So right now it's 1.7. We've put in 10 million as a placeholder. We expect it to be in that range, but we will update that when we get a formal recommendation from GHD. And the geyser catastrophic reserve has increased from 1.25 to 3.3. Other updates on that general policy is that we're proposing that you specify a broader range of potential issues. Right now, it really just focuses on earthquake, and we're proposing that they include language dealing with other natural disasters such as fires, floods, pandemics, etc. We're also asking or proposing that you modify the reserve policies over time to keep up with inflation, as the last bullet shows. Next slide. So this is sort of fast forwarding to the big picture for the water utility. So I'll walk through. Let me see if I can get my pointer out. Can you see my cursor, or is that no? Okay, let me get the pointer out here. See if I can do that. I'm not sure if I can get my. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen, that's why. Of course. Okay, I'll just talk through it. So in the top graph there is it's kind of hard to tell sometimes because the colors are so close, but the foreground is the blue. There are blue columns in the foreground, and that's those are your expenses. So the light blue are your operating expenses, the hashed blue is your debt service, and the dark blue at the top is your capital, your cash finance capital. In the background, you see green, which represents your revenue. So the dark green at the bottom is your non-rate revenue. It's your miscellaneous revenue that we mentioned. The middle green, the largest green section in the middle there, represents your existing revenue that you get from your current rates. And the light blue all the way at the top represents the revenue that you'll be getting if you were to implement the rate increases that are shown down at the bottom, the percentages there. So at the bottom, you can see that for the next 4 years, we're recommending a 2% rate increase on July 1st or near to July 1st in the summer, followed by 3%, 3%, 4%. The years after that, the 4% and 3% after fiscal 26 are really just projected numbers. We're not asking for action on that, but it's just based on our projections, mostly driven by inflation. We expect the rate increases to be about on that order out there. You will notice that there's a 2% rate increase immediately followed by some slightly higher rate increases. That was done expressly to recognize the current economic conditions that your city is facing, that the entire country is facing. But the rate payers are, a lot of them are facing economic hardships right now, and so we wanted to make sure that we were cognizant of that and that we proposed rates that really minimize the impact to folks in the near term. In the middle, to help you interpret that middle graph, what you see, the dark black dashed line are your target reserve levels, and you can see that increase at the very beginning. That's the increase in the catastrophic reserve levels that we mentioned, up to just above $20 million total. That's the sum of all your reserve targets. The catastrophic reserve is amongst your reserves. And then you can see how the light blue line is your actual ending fund balance, and you can see how it's already up near $20 million. So we're not really proposing much of an increase to your total reserves, and you can see how that over time stays really close to your reserve targets all the way out through the end of the planning period. The last things on this graph to point out are your debt coverage ratio. So these numbers are very healthy. They're basically non-factors. Really the minimum that you are allowed to keep because of your debt obligations is 1.25 or in that region. We like to keep it above 1.5 just for credit rating reasons. And you can see that you really don't have much debt as compared to your revenue. And so the numbers are very healthy. And then you can see the total capital spending summarized numerically at the bottom as well. So that's the water utility financial plan. On the next slide, we'll talk about wastewater. And so you can see it's the same graph, so I won't go through all of the nuances of the details, but you can see that, again, the top graph is well balanced. I forgot to mention that in case it's not clear, that anytime that the sum of the sums is equal to the sum of the green background, that's basically a year where the budget's in balance. So if the green's ever higher, then you're building your reserves in that year. And if the columns are ever higher, then that's a year where you're and a deficit, and that you're drawing down on your reserves. You can see that you're building your reserves a bit in year one there, and then it's staying very steady over the course of the planning period. The rate increases that are being proposed here are 2% per year for the next 4 years, followed by slightly higher rate increases thereafter, largely being driven by what we expect inflation to be. Again, the debt coverage ratio, very healthy on the wastewater, for the wastewater enterprise. And then there's two different capital spending. There's what we call your local wastewater capital spending, shown second to bottom row, and then your regional CIP on the bottom row there. Next slide. So here's a summary of the rate increases that we're proposing. And we're almost at the end here, so rather than take questions now, I'm just going to get through the slides, and then we can come back to these slides to cover any questions that you might have. Next slide. When you, actually, Jennifer or Kimberly, did you want me to pause at this point to take questions on the financial plan, or should I get through the whole presentation?
I think it's okay to continue through these last slides, so I don't think they'll take a long time.
Okay.
Come back to any slide that you want to look at if you have some questions.
Okay. Yeah, if anybody wants to jump in, feel free. So the rate setting objectives, so these are the things that we take into consideration when we're setting your rates. And again, a lot of these are a reflection of what was done during your last rate study about 5 years ago. We kept the same objectives for the current study, and again, we made very little changes. But first and foremost, we want to make sure that you're meeting your financial obligations and that you're legally compliant with your rates. The legal compliance obviously is critical, and the rates that you currently have in place are meeting all those requirements, and so it's good that we're keeping the same rates. We do, to the extent that we can, from a legal perspective, we want to encourage water conservation. The rates are designed to make sure that your revenue is stable and predictable, especially in the event of drought. And we think we found a good balance for protecting you from those events. Obviously, we're looking to minimize rate increases, and specifically, we looked to really minimize immediate rate increases given the current pandemic. We are always trying to promote affordability and keep your rates simple so that the public can understand what they're paying when they look at their bill. Next slide. Some of the cost allocation principles to be aware of that ended up driving who pays what. We identified different buckets of costs. So some of your costs are what we call customer costs. That would be customer service, billing, those sorts of things. And we assign those customers to everyone, regardless of whether they're a big customer or small customer. So if you're a customer, you get your fair share of customer costs. Capacity costs are associated with the size of your system. So this is looking at the costs associated with the size of your pump stations and your pipes and your treatment systems and all the general size of your utility. And those costs are fixed, predominantly fixed, and they're assigned to customers based on the size of their meter, because the size of someone's meter is also fixed, doesn't change, and it's a reflection of how much capacity is needed to serve that customer, whether or not they use it. The commodity costs are costs associated with purchasing and treating water and distributing it, pumping it. So all those, electricity costs and water purchase costs. And those are assigned to customers based on how much water they use. And then we looked at that water supply and your water conservation costs to justify the tiered rates, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail on a coming slide here. And then on the wastewater side, there's different rates that are charged based to customers, based not just on how much sewage they produce, but also on the strength of that sewage. So some of your commercial customers produce higher strength sewage, and it takes more energy and chemicals to treat that sewage. And so we make sure that we pay them a premium for that higher strength sewage. Next slide. So if you look at how costs were allocated into those three big buckets I just mentioned, the customer cost, the capacity, commodity costs, you can see here in this graph that it's predominantly the commodity costs, and that you have some costs that are for just serving accounts and the remaining costs for capacity in the form of your infrastructure. Next slide. So justifying tiered rates is very important from the standpoint of Proposition 218. Again, that's the law that governs how you can charge your rates. And there's been a flurry of of lawsuits that have transpired in the last 10 years or so on the heels of a landmark court case that happened down in San Juan Capistrano. And so it's really important, more important now than ever, to make sure that if you're going to charge tiered rates, that you have a very clear rationale for why some customers should pay more than others. So in this case, what you see here in the first two columns are the tiered rates that we charge for. And the first thing you'll notice is that there isn't really that big of a difference between the two. You know, single family tier 1 is just under $6, and single family tier 2 is not even $7. So the difference between them is pretty modest. The difference that does exist is because of the water supply. So you'll see that the blue section for single family tier 1 is a little bit smaller than for tier 2. And that's because you do receive a small amount of your supply from groundwater, which is significantly cheaper than the water that you purchase from Sonoma County. And that water, even though it's a small part of your portfolio, is really a fraction of the cost of your purchase water. So we're giving the benefit of that cheap water to folks who use water in tier 1. And so that effectively lowers the average cost of water supply for that tier 1 water. And people in tier 2 pay only for Sonoma for the purchased water costs and don't get the benefit of the cheaper groundwater. The other portion at the top there is your water conservation costs. So you do have a water conservation program, and the logic here is that but for your higher water users, you wouldn't need a conservation program, and so we go ahead and charge those costs to tier 2 users. You can see multifamily commercial, they pay a uniform rate, which means they only pay one rate regardless of the water usage, and they also share in those water conservation costs because they also benefit from that program. And then for irrigation, they have the same justification. They carry more of the burden of the water conservation costs simply because of the amount of water they use. It's a function of how those costs get allocated. So but it's all done very equitably based on known metrics. Next slide. So here are the rates that are being proposed for the water. This is for year 1. You can see in the first column your current rates. Then the second column shows the proposed rates for July 2021, and then the change in the form of dollars and percent. And you can see that the change is quite modest, and it does vary a little bit from different categories. And again, the fact that it's different in different categories is simply a function of the fact that we've updated the cost of service metrics, and so that ultimately ends up being routed. Those different metrics end up affecting the usage rates versus the monthly service rates slightly differently depending on the change of the inputs. And so all these different components change a little bit differently from one another. It's important to note that in year 2 and 3 and 4, these differences won't exist. They'll all go up by the same percentages as noted in those earlier slides. But in year 1, results do vary depending on what cost category we're talking about. Next slide. So same slide, but for wastewater, again, it shows the current rates compared to the year 1 rates. and the change that's being proposed by the different categories. And again, the results vary just because of the inputs to the cost of service analysis. And I think last slide. Last slide for me, I believe. So this is, there's a lot of numbers on those previous slides, and I didn't spend too much time with them because, frankly, they're kind of hard to make sense of just looking at the numbers in isolation. What makes a lot more sense and what's easier to digest are these numbers, which is what we call a bill impact analysis. So what we did is that we identified some typical customers that exist out there and how they use water, and we wanted to show you the total change in their monthly bill. So you can see at the top there, we've got 4 different examples of single-family homes, from a low water user to a high water user, and their bills for the water, both the current bills with the bills that they would pay with current rates, then the next column, the bills that they would pay with the proposed rates, and then the total monthly change in the last column. And so you can see those percentages in the last column are all quite similar amongst your different ratepayers, meaning that none of the changes that are being proposed are being disproportionately ending up in one lap versus another. It's really being spread out pretty evenly, which is good news. I think that it's not going to be disproportionate for anyone. Next slide. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. There is one more bill just to put things in perspective. Again, for that typical average residential monthly bill for a resident that uses about 7,000 gallons of water per month, and a sewer cap. So the sewer cap describes how much water is expected to be returned to the sewer. You can see that their current bill is almost $150, and you can see the monthly increases that will happen in year 1 through year 4. And the pie chart showing what parts of their bill, how their monthly bill is split up in terms of the different components that we talked about. Next slide. Here's a survey that we did of the region showing some of the most expensive cities and utilities in the area and the least expensive. And you can see that Santa Rosa is really in the middle of the pack there. And these rate increases that we're proposing really doesn't change your rank. I expect for the next, even after years 2, 3, and 4, you probably still won't jump ahead of the next city up. And keep in mind that they're all going to be raising their rates over the next coming years as well. So this snapshot of what the rates look like now will probably, those rankings tend to stay pretty even with one another. If anything, your city of Santa Rosa's rate increases are quite modest compared to some of the rate increases that Bob and I are looking at for other clients. So you're probably going to get passed by a couple cities in the coming years. Next slide. So I'd like to hand this slide over to Kimberly to say a few words.
So we want to, right before we get to questions, just talk about communication with our customers. In the current virtual world that we're in, we've had to work to create an outreach plan that can reach our community with the constraints of not being together or being with them in public. And so you can see that we are using all of the digital and written tools that we have available to us. There are many options that are listed here for you. You were also previously shown a video on our campaign, The Value of Water. I was going to try and show the second video, but I will let you know I decided not to, just because we had so much trouble last time getting it to run smoothly through the public Zoom meetings. So instead, we are more than happy to provide you with the link so that you can watch both the first video again if you choose to, and then also so that you can see the second video that has been released. And we are working towards a third video And then our next step will be to move more towards not just the value of water campaign, but also information about the actual rates themselves and the proposed rate schedule. And so that will be coming out and forward also. And at this point, we'll have a stopping point here. If you go to the next slide and take questions from this portion before we move on to the water shortage charges section of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Hildebrand and Deputy Director Zanino. Open it up for questions from the board with regards to this initial presentation. Board Member Wright.
CMI. Yes. Not really a question, just a general comment that I have to applaud all the staff and everybody for the rate that we're actually charging our customers right now, that it is only 2% in the first year, which is extremely low. And the thing that is most concerning to me is that 3/4 of our rate of our costs, at least for water, or 2/3 or something like that, is the commodity cost, the actual purchase of the water from Sonoma Water. And so that's an unknown for us. And so that we're, anyways, I guess my hope is that Sonoma County or Sonoma Water will do their due diligence as well to keep the rates reasonable for our customers during these times of pandemic and troubled financial problems and so forth. And that's my comment.
Just a quick clarification, fair point, and you're right, the vast majority of those commodity costs are for purchasing the water, but we do include other costs like electric and chemicals and other costs that change with the increase or decrease of water.
Thank you, Board Member Wright, and thank you for the clarification. Other board member questions or comments? Yes, Board Member Walsh.
Yes, thank you, Chair Galvin. Is this the appropriate place to ask any specific questions on the rate study itself, or are we just having questions on the presentation? Is this right?
Deputy or Director Burke, do we want to wait until till Mr. Reed has finished before we get to rate questions, or?
I think Chair Galvin and Board Member Walsh, yes, you can ask questions on the rate study itself at this point or the presentation. The next portion of the presentation will focus on the water shortage charges specifically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I have comments and a couple of questions. First on the comments, I think the quality of the consultants' work and the city staff's communication expertise and their ability to communicate allows the public to ask questions and understand what they're doing. And I think it's just fantastic, high quality conversation. And the questions that I have are whether or not we can add a little bit to that conversation. And then I have one specific question about the calculation, and that's on the capital improvement plan for the water at page ES4 in the actual study itself. We were saying that the fiscal year 2022 to fiscal year 2023, we're saying there's going to be a 3% inflation on CIP, but it looks like it's a ES4 that we went from 13.8 million to 14.6 million, and that's more like 6.7. So is that a clerical problem, or is it, can you help me out with that?
Let me.
It's also in the presentation itself, sir.
Okay. What slide was that on?
It's on ES4.
Right. ES4. Let's see here.
Mark, it's on the slide that shows the graphs projecting going forward on our expenses and revenues, including our CIP.
That's slide 8. At the beginning of the conversation, I'm sorry, in the study itself, the executive summary, it's at page 4 of the executive summary.
Okay, let me pop that up.
In the prior page, we said the benchmark for the capital improvement was 3%. And then on that graph on ES4, fiscal 2022 is 13.8 million for capital. Fiscal 2023 is 14.6 million.
Oh,
That's 800,000 on 13.8. The others from there, when you go from 23 to 24 to 25, are about 400 to 500,000 per year, and that looks about right. Just eyeballing.
I see. Okay, yeah, thank you. That there is something going on in there that's not just inflation, and I'll have to pop the model open to refresh my memory on exactly what's going on in that particular year. Go ahead and ask your next question. I'll start looking that up.
Great, and thanks. And these are just, I just want to make sure you're okay with these. I don't know if it's a mistake or not. I just want to be able to communicate that to the public if they were to read this study.
Sure.
Then the other thing is on the benchmark itself, where we're starting out with, let's just say 13.4 million. Is that based on an industry benchmark that we can describe, or is it just based on what we've been doing so far? So let's keep doing that at 3% a year. And then where are these funds sitting if we're not spending that rate? So if we don't spend 13.4, let's say we spend 12.4, but we've taken that 1 million in rates. Are you assigning reserves within the enterprise fund, or are those going to a city's capital project fund that's restricted for enterprise uses? What's going on with that component of the rates? If our budget's different from the actual there?
I can answer that question for you.
Okay, thank you.
So we have, and we continue to have a dollar amount that was determined years ago for the amount that we should be investing. We have reevaluated that and we'll be looking to increase based on recommendations how much we put into the CIP. Over the last many years, however, we, as all are aware, have had many emergencies, delays in getting projects out. So we did not feel that it was appropriate to put the recommended or the additional cash into the CIP at this point and put that on our ratepayers until we start spending down some of the amount that is in reserve or has been appropriated to the CIP fund, which is where it lives. There are 3 separate funds. One is a CIP fund that is for the water fund only and can only be spent on water projects. There is also a fund for the wastewater CIP, same thing, can only be spent on wastewater. And then we also have an additional CIP fund for the sub-regional system, and those are spent on sub-regional projects only.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'm so happy you're there. And do those funds roll up into the net position of the water funds, or are they in a city's governmental capital projects fund?
They're in a fully separate fund of their own that is literally for water CIP, wastewater CIP, and sub-regional CIP. That's all funds work for or do.
Yeah. Great, because I'm seeing when I look at the water utility fund and wastewater utility fund on the audited financial statements, June 30, 2019, it gives me 45 million unrestricted in water, 68 million unrestricted in wastewater utility. And so some of those, what we call unrestricted funds on the audited GAAP financial statements, for budgetary purposes, some of those are considered capital projects funds, CIP, for those respective enterprises. Is that
correct?
Okay, cool.
And those actually, as they come forward, you will see it with budget this year. Those are actually all sitting in projects that are in progress to move forward. So those funds that go into the CIP are actually appropriated through the yearly budget process for specific projects.
I absolutely, I love that. And then are we taking those funds into account? This is for the consultant or Kimberly. Are we taking those into account when we model the CIP needs into the rates from 2021 forward?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So we're only doing that 3% increase now. But as we move forward and get some projects out, then we will likely be looking to increase the CIP amounts in later years as we have debt service that also kind of releases funding back to us. We also will have the ability to make decisions. And as Mark mentioned as well, we're only talking about that first 4 years. And so we'll be going through this entire process again before we come back for that next rate schedule and reevaluating all of that.
So if it's okay, if we could increase the conversation by including what the current gap, what the current budgeted or audited financial position is, and then we have some CIP reserves that we're going to use, that might be helpful. On the capital, on the capital component, so if we're basing it on the need going forward, and we have the presentation on the water CIP on the asset management, so we need 518 million for the next 20 years. I don't want to start doing the math, but it looks like it's less than 13 million a year. Could we describe what that benchmark is in the study itself, so that we, if the public asks questions, we can maybe answer that? Because there's some mention of an association benchmark in the study, but it just referenced that there was a benchmark. And then, and sorry if I'm asking too many questions, but there's another point in the conversation of wastewater CIP where if we get to, and this is at ES8, the ES8, the bottom paragraph, we're saying the capital appropriation budget is going to increase in conjunction with a decrease in the debt service. And that's soared by, so when debt service goes down by 5 million, we would increase the capital improvement budget by 5 million. And that kind of seems like we're backing into an answer, or that we're back, we're holding the current rate consistent instead of lowering it. And so that kind of begs the question, do we need to have some projects out there to say, this is what we think we're going to do with the money, or explain what that benchmark is, and that we're not hitting the benchmark until we decrease that debt service, and that we can increase capital improvement to catch up with that benchmark. So I'm kind of looking for some sort of anchor for how we come up with the capital improvement project part of the rates.
So thank you, Board Member Walsh. I can speak to that a little bit, and then Deputy Director Zanino might have something to add. So as was mentioned, an initial study was done by engineering to get some recommendations for our water and wastewater CIP. That amount has been carried over time. We did an analysis of our infrastructure, and just like the rest of the industry, pretty much, state and nationwide, we're behind in our investment. And so over time, we should actually be doubling the amount that we're investing currently in our CIP. We've presented that information to the BPU before. So at this point in time, though, in looking at the resources as well as the emergencies that we've been going through, and the amount of projects that our engineering teams can take on at this point in time, we think it's prudent right now, based on what they can achieve, to keep these amounts consistent with what the initial recommendation was, although inflating year over years was discussed. As was mentioned by Deputy Director Zanino, going forward in our next rate increase, we'll definitely be re-looking at that, and we are hopeful to be bringing additional investment in our capital going forward.
Okay, that's perfect. Plus, we'll have another rate review before we get to 26 anyway.
Correct.
Okay, great. I just wanted to kind of highlight that if we had some sort of benchmark or anchor or project list to show the public and include that as an exhibit or addendum to the report, that might be helpful.
I will add too that we do we have a 5-year planning for CIP. Okay. Only as it comes through budget, we only approve year 1, but we display 5 years worth of projects. We also have studies for each of our utilities, water, wastewater, and sub-regional, that identify long-range projects that we need to be considering as well, out to 20 years. So there's a very robust process that goes on in those reports as well that determines what those projects are. And as we go through the budgeting process, you will see documents that come to you that show you 5 years worth of CIP planning for projects, even though you're only looking to recommend the first year to City Council, who would approve the first year of the CIP budget.
And that's fantastic, and I agree with that. The city has probably the best in class reconciliation of CIP to budget. And I've looked at audit reports for economic analysis, and the tie into the budget's fantastic. So I appreciate that. Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Mr. Hildebrand, did you have the response to the initial question from Board Member Walsh?
Yeah, I think taking a look at that, that was a good catch. I think a more apt description in that paragraph would be to say that and starting in fiscal 23 would be when that inflationary adjustment starts. And I'll get with staff to make that change.
Cool.
Thank you. Yes, Vice Chair Arnone.
A comment and question. First of all, I just want to comment on how timely and good it is to see the new expertise on our board from new Board Member Walsh's questions. It's good to see that level of expertise on the board, and appreciate the fact that you read all this. So, so it's good to have you on board.
I've got COVID problems. Thank you very much, Mr. Arnone. I have COVID issues here.
My question is that on slide 16, with the recommended wastewater rate schedule, it appears to be there's one classification of charges that are actually going down with this set of recommendations, having to do with the different size meters of multifamily, commercial, industrial, institutional users. And I'm just curious as to why that one classification of rates went down.
Bob, do you want to? I mean, we could both answer that, but this is your original model.
Yeah, in the wastewater rate schedule, as Mark had indicated, what we did was we updated the cost of service analysis to reflect the current budget and financial information for the utilities, which changes a little bit over time, as well as the customer base changing a little bit. We were also cognizant of, the revenue mix between the fixed service charges and the wastewater usage rates, which are tied to water usage and wastewater flows. And as a result of going through that cost of service update, we did find it appropriate to have pretty modest reductions in the amount of the service charges for most of the meter sizes across the range of meter sizes. For single family customers, the fixed monthly service charge is not tied to the size of the meter, because in general for single family, the different meter sizes is associated with irrigation needs and not so much what the requirements are for wastewater. So it's the same amount regardless of meter size for single family, but across the other customer classes, it is a function of the meter size. And so really what we're seeing here is the result of the updated cost of service analysis and the new financial information that we were working with as we were going through the study.
So it's justified by the actual historical usage is the reason why these went down.
Usage, customer base characteristics, and the financial information, the financial makeup of the utilities costs and how those are allocated out to the different components.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Other board member questions or comments with regards to the cost of service study and the proposed rate schedule? Okay, hearing none, I guess we can proceed on then with the water shortage contingency plan. We'll take board comments and questions after that, and then open it up for any public comments.
Great, and this is Bob Reed, and Chair Galvin and other members of the BPU, thank you for the opportunity to present this information to you. Mark's presentation on the water and wastewater rates was really focused on normal water supply and demand conditions and usage characteristics, looking out over a 10-year planning period. The water shortage contingency plan is something that is done to look at what happens when we don't have a normal water supply and demand situation. If we go to the next slide, the water shortage contingency plan is a component of the urban water management plan. And I think most or all of you are aware the urban water management plan is something that is required by the state to be prepared every 5 years. The last one was completed in 2016, and so the new update is in process. And basically the urban water management plan provides pretty detailed information about the utilities' water supplies, customer base and demand characteristics, as well as water conservation program elements to it. So it's a pretty comprehensive report that's prepared every 5 years. One of the pieces of that is the water shortage contingency plan. And this is a plan intended to help guide the city and the utility through what happens during an extended drought situation where water supply is curtailed, and so it becomes necessary to curtail demand and water usage. The state has recently, and I think really on the heels of the last drought that we had a few years ago, the state has prescribed various water shortage stages with use reduction goals for each stage. Basically, it's up to 10%, then 20%, 30, 40, 50%, and more of water use reductions in these various stages. And so as the city has been preparing its water shortage contingency plan, it's looking at those state guidelines, but has decided to be a little bit more refined than the state guidelines and has identified 8 water shortage stages. And in conjunction with that, those are different levels of water use reduction that would be required depending on the water supply situation. And then in conjunction with that, we looked at, from the financial perspective, of what happens to the utility when water supplies are curtailed, so water demand is reduced, what happens to revenues and expenses, and how do we meet the financial needs of the utilities in those constrained, non-normal situations. And here we are looking at water shortage charges, which are part of the rate structure, and then also excess use penalties, which kick in at the more significant stages of shortage. And I'll go into more detail on both of those. I would like to say that the city already has adopted policies, and these shortage charges and excess use penalties are already in place based on the last water shortage contingency plan. And what we're doing at this point is updating those that policy and those rates and charges consistent with the new water shortage contingency plan and the new state's guidelines for shortage stages. So if we go to the next slide, this sort of summarizes the different stages of shortage that can exist. And in the city's water shortage contingency plan, we're looking at 8 different stages of shortage. The initial stage, which goes beyond a normal supply condition, would be when there's a very modest use reduction goal of just up to 10%. It includes voluntary conservation measures intended to help the city achieve that water use reduction goal of up to 10%. And with that, we would not have any water shortage charge or excess use penalties associated with that. As we move into the next stages of shortage, stages 2, 3, and 4, we're now into mandatory conditions where mandatory use restrictions would be imposed, and they ratchet up as you would expect through the different stages of shortage. And then you can see the use reduction goals associated with each of those. But in this next increment for stages 2, 3, and 4 would be included a water shortage charge, which would generate some additional revenue for the water utility. And then when we get into stages 5, 6, 7, and 8, as things continue to ratchet up, we would also bring into play the excess use penalty. And I'll describe both of those in a little bit more detail. But again, the intent here is as conditions become more severe, the actions taken in response to that ratchet up, both in terms of the restrictions that are placed on water use, imposed on customers in terms of limiting days that they can irrigate or whether they can irrigate at all, and other uses of water which come into play through those stages. So if we go on to the next slide, in looking at the financial condition for each of the different stages, what we do is we start with that normal water supply and demand condition, and then we look at what happens with different levels of water use reduction. Both revenues and expenses are affected, and it creates a financial deficit. We'll show that graphically in a moment. But we've developed a three-pronged strategy to bridge that financial gap to help the utility remain whole during these shortage conditions, regardless of the different stages. One of the prongs of this three-pronged strategy is to basically reach into our pockets and to use some of the available reserves that may be available within the utility. These might be undesignated reserves or potentially could be catastrophic reserves. And as Mark had indicated previously, there's been some discussion about updating the catastrophic reserve policy, and one of our recommendations is to potentially broaden the ability to use those catastrophic reserves, including for a water shortage situation. So one prong would be we would look at available financial reserves that we have to help bridge that financial gap. A second is to impose the water shortage charge. This would be an incremental increase to the water usage rates that would apply to all water usage, and it would generate a modest amount of additional revenue to help bridge that gap. And then the third prong of this strategy would be to defer a portion of the capital improvement program and thereby preserve cash. So it may be possible to delay or defer some capital spending and preserve some cash depending on the severity and also the duration of a water shortage condition. I did mention there will be also excess use penalties, but we are not expecting any revenue from those because those penalties could be entirely avoided by all customers if they reduce water use the way that they're supposed to. So we're not anticipating any revenue specifically from that, whereas the water shortage charge would generate some additional revenue. We go to the next slide. This shows what happens financially for the water utility at the various stages of water shortage. And as the blue bars in this graph are the expenses and the green bars are the revenues. And you can see, and it's, of course, as you would anticipate, if we're selling less water, we're going to be generating less water rate revenue. So the rates fall, or the rate revenue falls through the different stages of water shortage because we're selling less water. But expenses also decline. In particular, you're buying less water from Sonoma Water, so that expense declines. There may be some reduced pumping and some reduced chemical costs, some other costs. Most of your costs are fixed, but some of those costs will decline. And then there will be some areas where you will actually see some cost increases. The effort that you expend towards water conservation program and outreach and education programs to help your customers are likely to increase somewhat as you go through these stages of shortage. So we've tried to model what happens to both revenues and expenses at these different stages of water shortage in the analysis. And you can see the financial gap, the difference between revenues and expenses widens as we get into the more severe stages of shortage. So our three-pronged strategy is to help us bridge that gap between the revenues and expenses. And if we go to the next slide, this graphically shows how those different prongs, those three prongs would come into play or could come into play depending on how they're implemented. In stage one, because it's a voluntary condition where water use reduction goals would just be achieved through voluntary means imposed on customers. We would not impose the water shortage charge or defer capital spending, but instead rely on available reserves, either undesignated or catastrophic reserves that could be used to bridge that financial gap. But as we move into the mandatory stages of shortage, we would start to impose the water shortage surcharge, and that would increase with each stage of shortage. And then there would also be some reduction in the amount of capital spending. So you see the green portion in these bars and starting in stage 3 represent reduced CIP appropriations. So reducing the amount of money being set aside for capital projects. And there'd be some discretion between each of these, but the main one and the one that we're focused on is some additional revenue coming from that water shortage charge revenue. If we move on to the next slide, this shows, and I'll step you through this, but this shows the water shortage charges and imposes them on the water usage rates. And I'll describe this, but up at the top, you can see that first row, the water shortage charge starts at 5% in stage 2 and then goes to 7.5%, then 10% and on up through the different stages. This represents the increase that would be imposed on top of the then existing water usage rates. The shortage charge is not imposed on the monthly service charges. That part of the bill and that part of the rate structure would remain unchanged. But by increasing the water usage rates across the board by these percentages, you're creating a financial incentive for customers to do the right thing and to reduce some of their water usage correspondingly. So you can see in stage 2 that 5% adjustment to each of the rates. The rates that are shown here for the normal use is what's been proposed for July of 2021. So the first year of our 4-year rate plan. And you can see they've each been increased by 5%. And that occurs through stages 2, 3, and 4. When we get to stage 5, and this is consistent with the existing water shortage structure, we shift to a different rate structure where customers will be limited to a specific water allocation. And that for residential, it would be tied to the number of people per household, and then an allocation for irrigation, which ultimately at the high end actually gets cut off completely as well. And then also for commercial customers based on usage history and characteristics and their water needs, there would also be an allocation there. And what happens starting in stage 5 is water use up to that allocation. All water use would be at a uniform rate, which would be based on the normal rate plus at that point, a 15% water shortage charge. But then if they go over that allocation, over 100% of that allocation, they would, from 100 to 150% of the water allocation, they'd get into tier 2. So there's a higher rate there. It would be a 10% higher rate in stage 5. And then if you're over 150% of your allocation, you get into a second or a third tier, a 20% increase in the rate and pay a higher rate for that. These excess use penalties are things that can be completely avoided by customers. As I mentioned before, if they stay within their water allocations, they can avoid that excess use penalty entirely, and they would be just in that tier 1. And so we're not anticipating any revenue coming from the excess use penalties. However, if they do materialize, that money would be directed to help cover the water shortage costs, conservation program activities at the time, or to replenish reserves that are being depleted because you're bridging your financial gap in part by using your reserves. Again, this basic structure is in your existing water shortage contingency plan and policy and rates. and it's just being updated to reflect the new shortage contingency plan and the cost of service analysis. If we go on to the next slide, this really illustrates what happens with this rate structure, water shortage rates and the excess use penalties. This is showing what happens with a typical single-family residential customer and their water bills. The top half of this table shows what happens if that customer is compliant with the water use reduction targets and reducing their water use consistent with the needs depending on the various stages 1 through 8, what happens to their bill. And then the bottom half of this table shows what happens to a customer that doesn't reduce their water use over these stages and what happens to their bills. You can see in the top half of this that once we get into stage 2, a water shortage charge appears on the bill. So they're starting to pay a little bit of water shortage charge on all of their water usage. But they never pay an excess use penalty, even in the higher tiers, because they're meeting the use reduction goals. And you can see in the last column here, the total water bill for this customer meeting that water use reduction goal. Their total bill is lower than what their normal bill would be with normal usage. So even though they are paying this water shortage charge because their water use is going down, they are seeing a lower bill associated with a smaller water use. The converse, the customer that doesn't cut back at all, they are going to continue to pay all of the rates. The water shortage charge applies to all of the usage. That ramps up through the different stages. And then the excess use penalty also kicks in starting in stage 5, where you have the water allocations. And you can see there that customer is going to have pretty significant increases in their bill and hopefully encourage them to reduce their water usage. So this is really summarizes the benefits of this water shortage charge structure with the excess use penalties, and is really reflects an update to the prior policy, and is consistent with state guidelines as well as the city's new updated water shortage contingency plan. I wanted to conclude this presentation. We go to the next slide and bring things back in to the next steps in the rate setting process here. And Kimberly, I don't know if you want to take this over, but the water shortage rates, water shortage charges will need to go through the Prop 218 process and be approved with the normal water and wastewater rate structure. So that'll be a part of the process, even though that water shortage contingency plan and the urban water management plan are separate documents and are moving on a parallel track to the rate study. But the rate approval process and the public hearing process will need to incorporate the shortage charges with the normal water and wastewater rates for the next 4 years. And I'll turn it back over to Kimberly if you want to conclude.
I can go through next steps. As you'll see here, and you've probably already seen on your future calendar, that we will be back to see you again this month. On the 18th, we will come back at that time to request a recommendation to City Council. Once that is done, then we will have our City Council study session in March. We are also in the midst of preparing our Prop 218 notification for mailing. The Prop 218 process and the notification process is a quite lengthy one. And so we need to have that completed by the end of March and sent out before we have the public hearing, because there is a 45-day period for our customers and our community to make comment or protest on the proposal. In that Prop 218 notification, as Bob indicated, we will also be adding the shortage rates so that they are going through that same regulated process to make sure that they also are meeting all those requirements if we were to have to implement them at some point. And then finally, we will have the public hearing in May It will be near the end of May, and then there will be a 30-day waiting period for rates to go into effect. And so they will hopefully be effective by July 1st. That's the plan. And then our first billings in July 1st, that is a full entire cycle of reading and billing, would be those that would see the rate increase, if approved, show up on their bill. And that is, I believe, the last slide. More questions, yes. If anybody has any questions, comments, anything you would like us to follow up on, please let us know. We are here to answer, and we have other staff available as well if there's any questions related to the urban water management plan or those shortage charges if necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Reed, and also thank you, Deputy Director Zanino. I'll open it up now for any board member questions on Mr. Reed's presentation. Board Member Badenford.
Thank you for making that accessible to the non-engineer members here and the non-CPA members here. I appreciate it very much. Just a few clarifying questions on, my apologies if I missed it. Each year we approve, right, the pass-through rate from Sonoma Water. Has that been integrated into this into this new rate structure? Because my understanding is, right, we're going to discontinue that practice, correct?
Correct. So we will, because we have developed a good relationship, Board Member Wright pointed out earlier, talking a little bit about the pass-through rate. Year over year, Sonoma Water brings their budget to us, the water contractors, and we work with them every single year to make sure that we are staying within a range of increases, which is usually between 4% and 6%. They have worked with us to stay there. We haven't seen big fluctuations. And so because of that, we feel comfortable not doing a pass-through rate and instead doing a specific amount each year for that coverage. A part of that really comes about because we just want to make sure that our customers know what's coming their way. When we do the pass-through rate, what happens is that they don't know. We don't even bring that to City Council or BPU until spring. And so they don't really know, and the approval doesn't happen until literally right before their first billing in July when the rate actually increases. And so it really does provide more stability for our customers to plan as well for the future. We are trusting that Sonoma Water is going to work with us and continue to work with us to keep the rates within that 4% to 6%. And we will continue to follow that process of working with them at the beginning of their budget setting process to make sure that we are staying within that range.
Great. And also, along the way, the asset management and how do we anticipate future CIP. I remember former board member Dowd always bucketing it as we would anticipate, is it 1% for the, it's 1% or 2% for you. Jennifer knows what I'm talking
Replacement.
about.
Yes.
Has that also been worked in? And has there been big changes in that we wanted to, we estimate a repair to part of the system at 2% a year and another part at 1% of the year?
So you want to handle that one, Director Burke?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Board Member Badenford. And yes, that definitely was goals that we had in prior years in working with the board. Over the years, we have really implemented a much more robust asset management program. So the factors that were discussed in the previous study session is now what we take into account to really look at what our needs are going forward. So it's not just driven by age of pipe and pipe replacement, because those are what those numbers were based on, but it's based on all the factors that we talked about in the previous study session. And that's what we're looking at building in over time. And as we discussed earlier, we recognize we're going to have to build that up. and we will be looking to do that the next time we do the rate setting for this one. Because of our limitations on resources, we think it's consistent to keep it at the level it's at, but increasing by inflation.
Great. It sounds like a more useful calculation in that, right? Not every mile of pipe is the same value, is the same anything. So I appreciate that. On the water shortage charges, you know, of course, our staff and our team, you guys do such a fantastic job of forecasting and really keeping our customers at the center. As we come into potential shortages, you know, just abundant, clear notification of allocations, of what the crisis is, of how they can conserve incentives that we might be able to provide. I know we have a fantastic system of conservation incentives that we work with our customers with. And also to be clear on enforcement. Have we already started to do pretty heavy outreach, kind of forecasting for the community? How have we started to do that? Are there any particular high leverage collaborations that we've thought through, whether it's kind of our larger users, whether it's larger swaths of our residential customers via, I don't know, reaching out to property management firms? It just strikes me that as we walk into a shortage situation, allocations, clarity, and high leverage conservation opportunities become much more important. Something tells me you already have a long list, and I'm just interested really for the public's sake and for the board's sake, how we're walking forward with it.
Sure, and I can talk to that a little bit. I will recognize that this is a little disjointed for the board, and I do recognize that because we're only providing you the rate schedule and not the rest of the plan. The rest of the plan will be coming to the board, I believe, in April, along with the urban water management plan. And it outlines everything that you've just discussed, including customer information, conservation programs, enforcement, all of those pieces. So we will have a very robust discussion and information on that when we bring the entire plan forward. And part of what you'll hear in your next item has some discussion of already what we're doing in terms of the dry year conditions and the water supply implementation or water conservation implementation we're doing both individually, the outreach we're doing here, and regionally with our partners. So we've been through dry years and drought before. We're using all those past lessons learned. That information is also implemented into the plan we'll be bringing forward. And we do address all the pieces that you've mentioned, Board Member Badenford. Those are all the pieces that we use when we're dealing with dry conditions and potential shortage.
Fantastic, thank you. Today was great. A lot of fantastic staff reports. Appreciate all of your work today.
Thank you, Board Member Badenford. Other board member questions? Mr. Reed, I had one question with regards to the excess use penalties. You mentioned that you're not planning on seeing much revenue because they'll avoid those penalties. Do they have to avoid it by reducing in the following month and then they avoid the penalty, or is it longer period of time? How does that work?
The water allocations that would come into play in those higher stages of shortage, I think for residential customers, it's really will be a quantity of water per member of the household. So it's based on the number of people in each household, and then an allocation of water for irrigation as well. And once those come into play, the customer would need to stick within that water allocation to stay within tier 1 and avoid the excess use penalty. And if they go over that amount, then that excess use penalty would kick in. I'm sure there would be some outreach and education, informing the customers as to when, that water allocation and that rate structure would come into play, in advance of it actually kicking in.
So that following month, they would have if they exceed it, they would have a penalty in that billing, which they would have to pay. And then they would avoid the penalty in the following month if they had dropped their usage below the correct level. Is that it?
Correct. That's my understanding is how it would work.
Okay. So, but if they're consistently using more water, then they would potentially have excess use penalties every month.
Month after month.
Okay.
That's correct.
And Chair sorry, Bob.
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
Chair Galvin, we would, when we put out our Prop 218 notice last time, and we're in the process of putting that information together, we were very clear, and we'll be very clear with our customers what those allocations are and sending lots of information. So our intent is to be very forthcoming, and we will be. It's not only our intent, we will be very forthcoming with information to our customers, letting them know this is what your allocation is. Is this information still correct in terms of number of people in the household? And if you are able to reduce your bill per the allocate or reduce your use per the allocation, this is what the impact will be. If you're not, this is what the impact will be. So we will be doing a lot of outreach related to these pieces if we get into those higher level of shortage, because it is something that we want to ensure that our customers are well informed and understand exactly what the impacts will be. So that information we're looking at the best way we can incorporate it into our Prop 218 notice, but there'll be a lot of outreach so that customers are well informed.
Great, thank you. Vice Chair Arnone.
Yeah, kind of following up on the same issue. I heard clearly that the shortage charge is subject to Prop 218 requirements, but I wasn't clear on whether the excess use penalties are also subject to Prop 218 considerations, or whether they can incorporate for like punitive considerations in calculating the amount.
Yeah. I'm not an attorney, and I get my hand slapped whenever I practice law. But it's my understanding that the excess use penalties are because they are penalties, they're not part of the regular rate structure. And I was thinking today whether 5 years ago with the Prop 218 notice, whether they were included in the notice just so that people were aware of them. I think that was probably the case, but maybe Kimberly or Jennifer would know, and what the plans are going forward with the notice this time around.
So they were not included last time. So we were going to have to do an additional Prop 218 notification if we were going to enact any of those. The time before that, there was a Prop 218 notification that included them. And so that was part of the reason why we wanted to make sure that we included it with this rate cycle so that we could get it into the Prop 218 process and make sure that it was properly noticed, because noticing is not inexpensive. And we didn't want to have to do a separate notification for the shortage rates.
So that implies to me that it is subject, the penalty is subject to Prop 218 requirements. So that means you can't include a punitive element to it. Is that right? I mean, if you have to do a Prop 218 analysis to show that the associated costs are for justifying the penalty, then you can't be punishing people for using too much water.
So the water shortage surcharges do have a cost analysis, because they're intended to help bridge that financial gap that we are able to quantify and estimate. So it is on that basis. The excess use penalties are not intended to generate additional revenue. So, but I'm going to, we have discussed this and raised the issue with the city's legal counsel as to whether the excess use penalties are subjects, and it's been my understanding in the past that they're not subject to Prop 218. That doesn't mean that you can't include the information in a Prop 218 notice as an education outreach sort of endeavor. It seems to me a wise thing to do in terms of transparency and providing information to your customers, even if it's not legally required to do so.
Got it. That makes sense. That makes sense.
Mr. Maddow, did you want to chime in?
I just want to echo what Mr. Reed said in his last few comments. I've seen this issue arise with a number of different jurisdictions, and I share the view that he just expressed. Even though technically something in the nature of a penalty, an excess use charge, is not technically subject to the Prop 218 requirements, I believe that the prudent thing to do is to be fully transparent with every aspect of the district's rates and charges schedules, including something that is in the nature of an excess use charge, so that there can't be any doubt as to what it is that the city is doing. And to the extent that the arguments ever arise, you will have created an administrative record that will stand you in good stead should there be litigation challenging all or any aspect of the rate structure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other board member questions or comments? If not, then we will open it up for public comments. We're now taking public comments on item 5.2. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha, do we have anyone?
We have no public comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the presenters on this study session. We'll look forward to seeing it in the upcoming weeks with regards to our rate setting, and that'll take care of item 5.2. Item 6.1 are regular minutes from January 21st. Everyone was present, so those will be received and filed. Item 7.1 is a staff briefing. Director Burke.
Thank you, Chair Galvin, members of the board. Our staff briefing today is a water and recycled water supply update. And Deputy Director Water Resources Peter Martin, and Deputy Director Water Reuse Operations Emma Walton will be making the presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair Galvin and members of the board. Peter Martin here. I'm here with a water supply update, as well as providing you with some additional updates on some of the outreach efforts we've been doing in the dry weather period, and also providing some updates on some programmatic elements that we're implementing as well. It's like the presentation's being pulled up here. So you can go ahead and advance to the second slide. I don't know if you're getting tired of seeing this same graphic over and over again, but you know, obviously we got a nice little slug of rain over the last week. Unfortunately, it's not enough to reverse our fortunes, obviously, but we're still falling far behind percentage of normal for this time of year in the region, which is a little bit concerning. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. So Lake Mendocino, as of Monday, I guess in this slide, was about 29,000 acre feet, or approximately 41% of their target water supply for Sonoma water. Releases are currently set at about 25 cubic feet per second. The difference between the last time I gave this presentation is that obviously there seems to be that the reservoir has hit bottom. So if you see that black line, water supplies are starting to go up a little bit, which was as you can see too, also it's tracking very much like what we saw in the 2014 water year by that purple line, which was in the midst of the last historic drought. So next slide, please. So similarly, Lake Sonoma storage, where we at the city of Santa Rosa derive our water supply, is about 64% of storage for this time of year, or 157,000 acre feet. And their releases are currently set at about 94 CFS. should mention, since we have a new board member, that Lake Sonoma does hold approximately a 2 to 3 year water supply for the region, as well as the contractors, including the city of Santa Rosa. I guess next slide, please. So we were provided with an update at the Water Advisory Committee on Monday on the filing that Sonoma Water filed their temporary urgency change petition, or TUCP. They filed this request to allow them to modify their in-stream flow requirements in the upper watershed and better manage their storage in Lake Mendocino. This request was received by the State Water Resources Control Board and noticed publicly on January 19th. The State Water Resources Control Board has not responded in the form of a formal order, but Sonoma Water did say that they anticipate that will occur soon. So the proposed changes are mainly to their water right permit terms, allowing them to move the hydrologic index, or I guess perhaps the indicator of what water supply conditions are in the watershed, from a determination based on inflow into Lake Pillsbury, which is in the Eel River watershed, and align it more with storage levels in Lake Mendocino. So Lake Mendocino storage would determine the conditions in the watershed. Sonoma's water proposal is such that as of February 1st, because Lake Mendocino is below the proposed 36,000 acre foot threshold, the conditions would be changed from what is normal today to critical. So that would allow them to reduce their mandated in-stream flows in the upper river, Russian River, by from 75 CFS to 25 CFS, cubic feet per second. It's important to note that at this point, no changes are proposed for in-stream flows in Dry Creek or the lower Russian River, where Santa Rosa does receive our water supply. But it's important to note that, as we heard on Monday, Sonoma Water is monitoring storage in Lake Sonoma, and they will continue to reevaluate that to see if additional changes are needed in this spring. And that would have impacts, obviously, for in-stream flows from Dry Creek and below at the confluence of the Russian River out to the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. So this request is pretty much exactly the same as what we saw in the 2013-2014 water year. As I mentioned in my previous slide, water supply is trending very closely with what we saw in that year. And Sonoma Water's water supply forecast modeling shows that there is a risk of Lake Mendocino reaching critical levels of less than 20,000 acre feet without some intervention now. So at the Water Advisory Committee on Monday, we did learn that Sonoma Water sort of reviewed their long-term historical rainfall, stream flow, and storage records, and found that in similar water years, below normal conditions will persist in the majority of the scenarios that they model. So basically the chance of a rebound to normal conditions at this point is becoming more and more unlikely. So this is concerning, obviously, in the upper watershed, because Sonoma Water relies on Lake Mendocino to meet late season fish flows and the demands of their water contractors in the upper watershed. It's important to note too that I just want to remind everyone that PG&E for the Potter Valley project, which does terminate into the East Fork of the Russian River, did ask for a variance for their flows per their hydroelectric project permit through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to reduce their minimum flows from 45 cubic feet per second to 15 cubic feet per second. So there's also an anticipation that there'll be reduced amounts of water coming out of that project into the upper Russian River watershed. So lastly, Sonoma Water staff did note that reduced flow regimes would need to be monitored and sort of consulted on with the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They do know that salmonids are present in the watershed right now, and they're being monitored. And additionally, those flow regimes, they need to make sure that they're considering the impacts to water quality and protecting all the other salmonid life stages through their flow regimes. Next slide. So just in response to this ongoing dry weather, I just want to highlight a few things. You've heard a lot about this over the last couple months, but We're continuing to coordinate with our regional partners. It's important, as Director Burke had mentioned before, we've been here before, we've sort of got a game plan. And so we're working to make sure that we're working with them collaboratively, all the Sonoma Water and the contractors, as well as the Sonoma Marin Water Saving Partnership, to understand if proactive or progressive measures are going to be necessary in light of this lingering dry weather. For this month, we are going to be conducting additional outreach in the form of a new radio spot, which encourages customers to maintain water smart habits. We'll be continue to put out digital media in the form of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter posts. And then additionally, the continued customer bill messaging and folks' customer bills. And then we use the City Connections newsletter, which has quite a wide range of folks that actually receive that as well. And then just, I did want to note that there is a significant overhaul going on with our Water Smart Yard page, web page, which directs customers to rebates and other sort of things that they can do to be more water smart in their yard. And that's in anticipation of outdoor irrigation season happening. So for the next slide, please. I just wanted to take time here to give a brief overview of the benefits of advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, to our customers, and sort of showing how it's ensuring our routine management of the city's water waste ordinance. This has been an important tool, AMI, that's paying dividends through the city's investment in improved customer meter infrastructure and the data that comes out of that improved infrastructure. So this graph sort of looks at some of the cases that we've seen over the last few years. And in this graph, you can see, obviously, we not only saw an uptick in complaints last year, but we've been able to have greater impacts in our follow-ups and response to customers through the review of billing data. And would only be available through the Santa Rosa Water's new sort of AMI program that's been put in place in the last few years. So as you can see, the water use efficiency team actively responded to more than 340 cases in 2020, but also had significant follow-up with customers on flagged usage data, and also issued several warnings. Next slide, please. So this is just a graphic that shows you sort of a further breakdown of those water waste reports by month. As you can see, last year we were sort of averaging about 1 complaint per day that required follow-up by staff. And so while these public complaints and other complaints sort of are an important tool in understanding the boots on the ground issues, I just wanted to provide in my next slide, sort of how we're utilizing individualized customer data to better follow up and investigate water waste or customer losses. Many customers may not know they have a leak, and the billing department sort of flags what they consider continuous use cases, where we see just water continually running in a meter. We have data that's up to about an hourly sort of time frame. So those kind of flagged counts are sent over to water use efficiency team, and then they follow up with the customers. So I'll go ahead and just say, just advance the next part of this slide. In this first case, we have a large institutional customer, which was actually a school. The water use efficiency team contacted them and provided them with an on-site socially distanced visit outdoors to look at their infrastructure. And then they also provided quite a bit of AMI history to help them understand their water use, including continuous use. So obviously found 4 large leaks, including in the irrigation system, some processed water leaks, and a service line fracture. So average savings there just in this one customer is 27,000 gallons per day. I should note that in many of these large customers, these folks don't know that they have a leak until the time that the water use efficiency team follows up with them. So they just assume that that's the cost and that's how much water they're using. So advance the slide a little bit. In this second case, a commercial customer, which happened to be a strip mall, the customer didn't realize they had a leak as well. So water use efficiency staff quickly followed up with them and they were able to pinpoint a wide open leak running in a vacant building for a toilet on that, in that strip mall. So those kinds of things are interesting too as well. And that, we're in a time where it's obviously buildings are not necessarily always being utilized, and they're sitting vacant. We can help customers save money and obviously water during this time as well. So advance the slide. This third case would be an irrigation only customer, which just happens to be a golf course. We sort of surmised that one of the leaks had been occurring since 2017. That leak sort of increased over time from 160 gallons per minute to over 600 gallons per minute. So they work closely with this customer, and we're able to find additional leaks and have an average saving of 14,000 gallons a day. I do want to just kind of highlight, I don't have any more on this slide, but I do want to point out too, I did learn about another customer that was a dialysis clinic that had continuous use. Just recently we followed up and we did find out from talking with them that continuous use is mostly to be expected based on their processes. But then we also found that they had a small leak. And so water use efficiency staff worked hand in hand with them to determine the nature of their leak. And then, obviously this opens the door for them to continue to build a relationship and help them to reduce their continuous use and maybe even some process improvements. So this contact is very good because we can't have a lot of our face-to-face customer interaction that we've been used to in the past. So I did want to just close with that. The water use efficiency team is sort of working with the vendor that SmartWorks that processes and displays the AMI data to help us to develop a routine report that shows water savings for single family customers when we do follow up on these. So this will help us obviously to track our calculated savings through this program, and also help us to work through these continuous use issues as well. So I guess go to my last slide here. Just want to remind everyone that we're here to help, and the water use efficiency team can be contacted at srcity.org/watersmart or the phone number there below. So with that, I will hand over the presentation to Deputy Director Walton.
Thank you, Deputy Director Martin. Good afternoon, Chair Galvin and members of the board. I'm Emma Walton. I'm the Deputy Director of Water Reuse Operations. I'm here to provide a very brief update on our recycled water supply as our conditions of and availability of our recycled water haven't changed much. So next slide, please. So first, I'll just show you our recycled water production curve. The gray line there shows the average for about the last 35 years. The blue line is our water production from last year, which I've mentioned previously was our historic low up until this year, which is represented by the black line that runs along the bottom there. Up until this month, we had been averaging around 14 million gallons of production per day, which is about what we see during the summertime. So really a reflection of little to no rain. This month, we did see an uptick in our production. We have reached almost 16 million gallons a day on average. We got up to as high as about 24 million gallons per day, but not for a very sustained period. So our average is still pretty low and really much lower than last year, which was a pretty hard year for us with respect to recycled water. So if you go to the next slide, please. Here's what we have in storage. Again, the gray line there showing an average year, and then the black line along the bottom showing our current situation. We did receive, because of the small amount of rain that the region received, we did get a small uptick in our storage, about 50 million gallons of additional storage. This was actually for two reasons. One, because of the rain we got, as well as the storm knocked out power to the geysers pump stations up on Pine Flat Hill. So we were offline and not pumping water to the geysers for about a day. So we gained a little bit more in storage than we would have otherwise. Just a reminder, we would like to see the black line on a much steeper upward trend in order for us to be gaining in storage to use for the coming summer months. However, it is not on an upward trend. It's on a slight upward trend only because we are sending less to the geysers than we typically would be this time of year. And Windsor is sending more to the geysers than they typically would, which helps offset what we send as well. So much lower than we would like to see and not gaining as much as we would like to see. So next slide, please. So just again, a reminder that we are preparing for little to no recycled water being available for our interruptible customers. As Director Burke mentioned last meeting, we will be establishing an ad hoc to discuss how we want to utilize the very little recycled water that we will have. We are continuing to have meetings with our ag community, letting them know of the situation that we're in and providing regular updates. They've asked to see our storage curve on a regular basis, so we are providing that regularly so they can track it along with us. And then again, ongoing cooperation with our regional partners. I mentioned Windsor is pumping more to the geysers than they are actually contracted to pump, which is helping us maintain more in storage than we otherwise would. We're also in conversations with Sonoma Water and potentially, be looking at whether or not they will have water to provide to supplement the water that we have. Just as a reminder, while we do have regional partners who also produce recycled water, we produce substantially more than our regional partners. So while we ask for their help and we appreciate their help, it is minimal what they're able to provide with assistance. But every little bit does help. So we continue to have conversations with them. And with that, I'll take it to the next slide and open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Deputy Director Walton and Deputy Director Martin. Board member questions or comments? Okay, I don't see anybody. So thank you both for your presentation. Let's hope that, I know we don't have any rain on the horizon in the next week or so, but let's hope that things change between now and our next board meeting and maybe we'll have a more positive report. Okay, so at this point, we'll take public comments with regards to item number 7.1. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha?
We have no public comments on this item.
Thank you. That'll take care of the staff briefings. We have 2 items on the consent calendar. If anybody's willing to make a motion to approve those.
I'll move to approve the items on the consent calendar.
Second. Oh, there you go.
I didn't see who got the second. We have a motion by Vice Chair Arnone. Was it Director Walsh? Board Member Walsh?
Grable, second.
I'm sorry. Okay. Second by Board Member Grable. We'll now open it up for public comments on item number 8. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9. Anyone?
No public comments.
May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Chair Galvin.
Aye.
Vice Chair Arnone.
Aye.
Board Member Badenfort.
Aye.
Board Member Grable.
Aye.
Board Member Walsh.
Aye.
Board Member Watts. Aye. Board Member Wright.
Aye.
Thank you. Passes unanimously. We have no report items. Item number 10 is public comment on non-agenda items. So we'll take public comments now on item 10. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha, do we have anyone?
We have no public comments.
That will conclude item number 10. We have no referrals. We have no written communication. Subcommittee reports. You heard in one of our items that the contract review subcommittee did meet and approved what was item 8.1 of our meeting today. So I believe we have a report from the Water Conservation Subcommittee.
Yes, Chair Galvin, the Water Subcommittee, we met on January 25th and staff provided updates on 2 items, one of which was the water shortage contingency plan, which we did hear a little bit about tonight or today. And we will hear more about that as far as the full plan of the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. That'll come to the subcommittee first and then back to the BPU for consideration before the City Council in May or June. And staff also provided updates on the existing Santa Rosa Water Dry Year campaign activities and various updates on the water use efficiency program. And we provided some feedback on existing and planned efforts that will be sustained as long as dry weather conditions persist. And we did just hear the supply update. So hopefully we will get some more rain, but the staff is working very hard to make sure that we have all of the activities in place preparing for the dry weather. And that is it.
Thank you. Any board member questions regarding the subcommittee reports? Hearing none, we'll now take public comments on item 13. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha?
We have no public comments on this item.
Okay. Item number 14 is board member reports. Do we have any? I will report out, as was previously mentioned in the staff report or staff briefing, that we are establishing a recycled water ad hoc committee. And at this point, board member Badenford and myself will be serving on that committee and we'll be reporting to the full board as we get going. Okay, any other board member reports? All right, we're now taking public comments on item number 14. If there are any members of the public that wish to comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9. Secretary Atha?
We have no public comments.
Item number 15 is Director's Report. Director Burke?
Thank you, Chair Galvin. In the interest of time, I do not have a report for today.
Thank you. We're now taking public comments on item number 15. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha?
We have no hands raised.
Thank you. We'll now move to our closed session matter. Interim Legal Counsel, Mr. Maddow, would you please announce the closed sessions?
Yes, Chair Galvin. The board will be meeting in closed session on 3 items tonight as listed on the agenda. 2 of them are existing litigation matters. The first is Fountain Grove 2 Open Space Maintenance Association versus City of Santa Rosa. The second is in the matter of the City of Santa Rosa's petition for review of action and failure to act on the part of the California Regional Water Quality Control Board concerning the city's discharge permit. The details of the resolution number, et cetera, are listed on the agenda. Both of those are existing litigation matters, and the board can meet in closed session under Government Code 54956.9. The third closed session item is for the board to meet and give instructions to its real property negotiator, and that is permitted under Government Code section 54956.8. The property involved is 25301 Ramal Road and Skaggs Island Road. The assessor's parcel number is provided on the agenda. The The negotiator on behalf of the city, the water department, is Jill Scott. The negotiating parties on the other side are the Victor Leveroni Corporation, Joseph Leveroni, Patricia Stornetta, the Elizabeth Ann Leveroni Trust, and the Louise Leveroni Trust. And the negotiations concern price and terms of payment. And with that, I believe it would be appropriate to go into closed session, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before we go into closed session, I'll open it up for any public comments regarding items 16.1, 16.2, and 16.3. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. Secretary Atha, do we have anyone?
We have no public comments.
Okay, at this time, I would ask the board to please disconnect from Zoom and reconnect via the closed session Zoom information that was provided to you. And I'll see you in closed session. Thank you. Looks like we just need Board Member Walsh. Okay, I think everybody is back. If we could ask Secretary Atha to do a roll call, please.
Yes, Chairman Galvin,
Here.
Vice Chair Arnone,
Here.
Board Member Badenfort,
Here.
Board Member Grable,
Here.
Board Member Walsh,
Here.
Board Member Watts, Board Member Wright.
Here.
All right, so everybody that was in the closed session is now back, and we'll ask interim legal counsel, Mr. Maddow, to report out on the closed session.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The board has returned from closed session. There were no reportable actions taken during that closed session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, everyone, thank you for being here, and we will adjourn the meeting and see you in a couple weeks, and have a happy Valentine's Day in the meantime.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Okay, board members, can you hear me? This is the recording secretary.
I can hear you loud and clear, Patty. Chair Kincaid here.
Okay, perfect. Hi, Chair Kincaid. We have everybody's here and it looks like we're ready to start.
Okay, I'll ask all fellow board members to turn on their video and keep their audio on mute.